Camacho. I'm really very happy to take questions because otherwise keynotes tend to be very boring and also self-serving. So I'm very, very happy to be challenged by you. And also thank you so much for inviting me to share with you some ideas, reflections on migration, the Global Compact, what is happening now, what has happened, in fact, with the Global Compact from what I've been able to see since we adopted it last December in Marrakesh. And also, thank you for allowing me to change subjects. Since I came here, I've been talking about only NAFTA. So it's really good to talk about this again, which is such a human, important, politically complex issue. Many of you, I'm totally sure, and I even saw some names, familiar names, and even of friends in the list of participants to this forum. So many of you know what we did, how we did it, and what was the end result. So I will not bore you too much with that, just 2 or 3 comments to situate the conversation on the Global Compact, to keep bringing the larger picture of this issue. It was remarkable. It was remarkable. I think the real success of this, first and foremost, is that despite everything, despite history, despite years, decades of attempts in the UN, despite of polarization, despite the fact that at the time where we were building the Global Compact, negotiating the Global Compact, migration was on top not only of the global agenda, it has always been more or less there. No, on top of the political agenda, nationally, on top of the priorities of political parties, on top of the mind of electorates, and mostly in a negative way. That's the remarkable thing of the success of the Global Compact, that despite all that, in the midst of probably the worst rhetoric, the worst perceptions, the enormous manipulation and misleading information regarding migration, the fear creation statements and demagoguery, if I have to be honest. Despite all that, in the UN, we managed to sit together rationally, building trust amongst ourselves, and to produce something like this. And the key of this, and many of you have heard us say that ad nauseam when we were negotiating this process or leading this process, Ambassador Jörg Glauber and myself. The key of this was, let's understand it. Let's understand the phenomenon. How on earth are we going to build, draft, negotiate, conclude, if we, in fact, do not understand migration? And this, what I am telling you, is not an exaggeration. We did not understand migration. Despite the fact that we all had opinions, we all debated, we all discussed about it, we all argued in favor, against, yet we had no clue. And in fact, this "we have no clue" remains, by the way, very much what's happening today on the migration field and on the migration debate. So, back to the UN, we said, we accepted, we have no clue. Let's understand it. And this was so critical for the obvious reasons, of course. How, again, are you going to negotiate something or to solve or to address an issue that you don't understand? You will produce something absolutely useless, if not worse. But also, by understanding, which is what is clear, by understanding the phenomenon, by building data, figures, pictures of what is this all about, you also start doing something more important, which is building trust. Why? Because you start demystifying the phenomenon. Hadn't we done this, which took us a long time, we spend more time doing this than actually negotiating. Hadn't we done this as we did, we would have ended up negotiating, discussing, talking amongst ourselves based on prejudices, based on perceptions, based on misinformation, based on emotions, because migration has become very emotional. And again, this is still happening. So when we started, we could feel, we could see a totally polarized room, two groups, those in favor, those against. And slowly we saw that by educating ourselves, by understanding the issue, by building trust amongst ourselves, we saw how prejudices were left behind, and finally, a sense of common purpose arose. So instead of everybody being defensive or offensive, in trade negotiations, for example, if you see trade negotiators, if you go to WTO, they speak in these terms: offensive and defensive interests. It's totally common. Well, here in the UN, on this issue of migration, we couldn't afford to have this defensive-offensive thing. We needed to have only a common purpose, which was, let's address the subject. Let's address this massive challenge. And that's exactly what we did. So we managed then to build the compact together. What is the Global Compact? The Global Compact is, let's say, an instrument, a powerful instrument that gives coherence to the migration phenomenon, that understands, and that's the way it's reflected in the instrument, that we can't address migration partially. And this is an important lesson for everybody that is interested or involved on any migration-related issue. Migration is a complex, integral phenomenon that can't be addressed by pieces. You can't take one single side of the challenge and try to address it, ignoring the rest. And that's where we came with the notion or the concept that the Global Compact was going to address migration in a 360 degrees approach. Because everything is interconnected. Migration is a chain of events, is a chain of circumstances. So you can't address it by focusing only or disconnecting the links. You need to address from A to Z. because it's a cycle that has a genesis, has a process, and has a conclusion. So this is what we meant by 360 degrees. And this is exactly what is reflected in the Global Compact. If you see the 16 objectives of the Global Compact, you will see that they are following a logic. And the logic they are following is precisely the logic of the migration movement. So the Global Compact starts by addressing the causes of migration, as they say, the root causes of migration. What is it, what we all need to do to make sure that people are not pushed away, that people are not forced to leave their countries? In principle, most of the people don't want to do so. They want to stay home in their communities. That's only normal. But very often, which is the majority of cases today, they have to go simply because they have no life options at home, whether it's poverty, whether it's climate change, or it's about droughts, violence, you name it. They have to go. So the first part of the Global Compact is aiming at addressing that. We just can't think of how we need to deal with migrants when they arrive to the host countries. No, first and foremost is why they need to leave and how can we prevent that from happening. Then, if they want to go, that's another story. As a matter of choice, of course. Second part is about the moving, the transit, the migration itself. And what are the duties, what are the responsibilities of countries during that process? What is it what migrants need to be given or recognized? And then finally, and in this process, of course, is a question of smuggling, trafficking, and all sorts of measures. Then what happens when they arrive to a place? How they should arrive? What are the responsibilities of host countries? What are the responsibilities of the migrants themselves? They have responsibilities too. They should. And what are the minimum things a government has to provide to them? And then finally, a whole package of, let's say, institutional architecture, fresh one, in our view, different one to what we normally would have in the UN, so as to maintain in the UN, within the UN political structure, a permanent space, political space, where we all member states would not only have the chance but the obligation to keep talking about the Global Compact's implementation. And that is also a major change brought about by the Global Compact. In doing this, in this 360 degrees concept, there's something very important too. As we demand countries of destination to perform in certain ways concerning migrants arriving to their countries or to the shores, to the territories, we also, and this is again very much the Global Compact, should demand, should help, should work with countries of origin so they can fulfill their own duties. If populations are forced to leave, if they are pushed out, is because that country is failing to them. And I'm not judging the causes. They are very complex, but we can't ignore this element. And this is very important in the construction of all this new debate on migration. When we started, every time we heard about migration before the Global Compact, before this process, the typical debate is about the responsibilities of countries of destination. Fair enough. But we always felt short. We always were very timid, or the debate was always timid about the responsibilities of countries of origin. This Global Compact, this notion of 360 degrees, this very powerful instrument that got a fundamentally global consensus on it, amongst many other things, is because it's fair in the way it addresses the role, let's put it this way, of all countries throughout the migration process, origin, transit, and destination. This is very critical. Where we are, in my view, now, or what happened afterwards. The Global Compact went through a very, in the public opinion, in a very bumpy way. Because as we were getting to the adoption process, as we were getting to the conclusion of the negotiations, and then the conference, the adoption, and all that, this very negative rhetoric took hold. And quite wrongly, of course, many very conservative, far-right, I don't know how to call them, groups, parties, in many parts of the world, many parts, Europe, North America, and Latin America, by the way, took the Global Compact as their flag, as their negative flag. In fact, they used the Global Compact to galvanize an extreme right, an extreme intolerant, an extreme discriminatory movement, to the point that countries that otherwise were going to join the Global Compact were pushed away from the instrument. Only few. Still, it's very important to say it. So the Global Compact again became the symbol of the fear in many countries of these groups, and many of them political parties. So the Global Compact was on top of the political agenda in many places, including the electoral agenda, as I was saying at the very beginning. I think that wave is slowly fading away. Not the anti-migration, if you like, but the focus on the Global Compact as the symbol of what these groups or these countries don't want, or as the symbol to, or as the instrument to scare people. I think that's more or less gone. That's my impression. The attention is now focused on other things. Good. So the Global Compact keep working. And two things here, and with this I probably will conclude, so I will really happy to answer questions if that's the case. One is that despite all this, despite some governments saying we will not join, or even worse, the Global Compact is terrible, since this 360 degrees approach, since this multi-stakeholder thing, because migration is not only about governments, it's very much about civil society, it's very much about private sector, it's very much about employers, it's very much about trade unions, it's very much about workers. Really very much about that. So the implementors of the Global Compact are not only governments, let alone federal or national governments. It's very much about cities, it's very much about states, provinces. And we saw how in some of these countries where national governments were totally against, openly, visibly against, campaigning against the instrument, nationally, there were many actors marching in favor of the instrument and actually trying to start implementing it, which is remarkable. It shows that we really were right. And that is happening. The other issue is, I think, we also, when at the peak, at the end of the process, when the compact was adopted, I think those in favor of the Global Compact, those supporting the Global Compact were timid. I remember me talking to a crowd in Marrakesh about this and saying, and I say it again, those that promote, those that believe in the Global Compact, those that believe in global governance for migration, forget about the Global Compact. Those that believe in governance of migration, those that believe that migration has always happened and will always happen, and therefore we need rules, need to come out of the closet and say it. Really. Always, those that are against something are normally way more energized than those that defend. So the defend side of the debate was timid to the point that we ended up, and I say we, to share responsibility, but in reality, neither Ambassador Lauber and myself did it. We always were trying to do the same. But out of courtesy, we ended up explaining the Global Compact, defending the Global Compact by saying what it was not, almost apologizing. No, the Global Compact doesn't do that. No, the Global Compact doesn't touch your sovereignty. No, absolutely not. The Global Compact is only a bunch of recommendations. No, don't worry. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. That's what we did. It's terrible. And that's what I meant when I said, let's come out of the closet straight and talk and say and defend, and let's argue what it is about and what it is good. I think still we've not done that, and this is very important. And final point on this last reflection. When we built all the data, figures, understanding about this phenomenon, we also realized something else. The amazing, incredible, gigantic economic contribution of migrants. The incredibly large wealth creation of migrants, or by migrants. The famous 250-something million migrants around the world which represents 3.2, 3.3% of the global population, contributing with 6.7 or so trillion US dollars a year to the global economy, meaning almost 9%. So 3% contributes with almost 9% of the GDP. Amazing. Well, this also showed us or taught us something else. When we promote, when we defend, when we talk about migration, the same way we can't just focus on the responsibilities of countries of destination, but we also have to focus on the responsibilities of countries of origin. We should not only focus on human rights, humanitarian issues, challenging countries of destination because they are not good, because they have a moral duty to take care of these poor, suffering people that need to be aided or helped. All that is true. But in addition to that is the other argument, which is to what extent these people are contributing to your economy, country of destination, to your wealth, country of destination, to address your challenges, dramatic, by the way, demographic challenges, country of destination. And by the way, Canada is a great example of this. Really a great example. A country that is open to migration, has many avenues for migration, in a very economic-oriented way. And it's fantastic. This is exactly what it's about. With this, I'm not saying let's forget about those in need. Not at all. It's the same. It belongs to the same bigger package. My only message to you is focus on these two. These are very powerful, very persuasive, and above all, very real, very, very real arguments. With this, I conclude, and again, happy to take questions if that is the case. Thank you very much again for the invitation.